Okay, we are started indeed. This is Glenn Lowry at The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv, and I'm with Rajiv Sethi. Hello, Rajiv.
Hi, Glenn.
Rajiv is a professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University. He's a frequent guest in the past at The Glenn Show here, and an economist, a friend of mine, a co-author on some research papers and so on. And I'm a professor of economics at Brown, and we're talking here in the wake of the national crisis that has been engendered by the COVID-19 coronavirus, the new coronavirus pandemic, which has sort of washed over the globe, in fact, and has fixed all of our attention. Both Rajiv and I are teaching and carrying on our professional activities from our respective homes. We're, as it were, sheltering in place. I gather you have a general kind of lockdown situation in New York City. Is that right, Rajiv?
I don't think quite been imposed yet, but within the next 48 hours, we're expecting a lockdown. We're expecting to be told to shelter in place. But the streets are empty. Most businesses are closed. It's a bit of a ghost town already.
I wanted to talk to you, Rajiv, because without wanting to unduly flatter you, you're one of the most thoughtful economists and social science observers that I'm familiar with, and I myself am kind of overwhelmed with the intellectual challenges of trying to figure out what the best path forward is for society here, and how to make decisions about the important public health and public policy questions in front of us. I mean, there are a number of different dimensions to this. The foremost, of course, is the public health challenge itself, of stymieing the damage from the epidemic, of stemming the tide, of protecting ourselves from the worst case possibilities of public distress associated with the pandemic. Another set of concerns comes out of thinking about the economy, the impact on economic activity of our public health responses, how those costs are to be shared amongst the citizenry, what supports can be given to the most distressed, both in terms of the cost of healthcare, but also in terms of the cost of the economic downturn associated with our sheltering in place and such. And then there's a set of concerns having to do with our institutions and our values, since any actions that we take here in one way or another raise questions about liberty and social justice. And I know you've been thinking about that.
Yeah, as have we all, Glenn. Yeah.
So where to begin? Here's one set of considerations that I actually raised, and I had a conversation with Heather McDonald here, and I've had one with Larry Kotlikoff, which will have been posted by the time people see this. Heather, as you know, is a social critic, a pundit at the Manhattan Institute. She's a conservative and a contrarian, and she was at some pains to point out that we might be overreacting. This is the idea that we're in a panic, and in a panic, people are feeling compelled to do things out of fear that they don't properly gauge the cost of what they do. We are weighing the public health cost of the pandemic growing more intense. Should we not shut down economic activity against the economic costs of foregone income and dislocation from shutting down activity? How to strike that balance? Is there a risk that we might overreact? And she was raising that concern. And Larry Kotlikoff was talking about the essential requirement of limiting the spread of the virus, and recommending that basically we shut down entirely economic activity as much as possible for an extended period of time, long enough to be able to stymie the growth of the epidemic and sort of nip it in the bud. And if we lost 2 weeks or even 2 months of economic activity in the interest of stopping the epidemic, that would have been worth the cost. And I really don't know how to think about balancing these benefits and costs. What do you think?
Well, those are two sort of opposite views in some sense, right? That we ought to be closer to business as usual from Heather McDonald, and we should shut down completely for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
There's one small Italian town that has managed to basically reduce new cases to zero just by testing everybody, not by shutting down economic activity, but just by testing everybody. Now,
and isolating the people who test positive.
Yeah, which I think were about 3%, if I'm remembering right. I hope I'm not terribly wrong with that. But, just basically testing everybody, finding out, who's positive and isolating those. And the rest can basically continue as normal as long as they don't have any contact with the outside or with those who are isolated. And so testing, it seems to me, is the crucial thing. There has to be just absolutely massive, widespread testing, because a lot of the transmission is taking place from people who are not symptomatic. As much as 5 days before they show any kind of symptoms, and so just shutting down economic activity, I don't think is going to solve this problem as long as the transmission is proceeding and is sort of largely concealed, or at least partially concealed. But
what about the logistics of universal testing? How do you actually get that done in a country of 300 million people?
Yeah, I don't have a very good answer to that, partly because we don't have testing capacity of that scale anyway. We're way short of that. Korea apparently, managed to test a very large number of people. That seems to be the case study that we should be emulating. On many grounds, they had a fatality rate that's lower than just about anywhere else. They've managed to control the spread, and they have tested, extremely widely. They apparently the first Korean case and the first U.S. case were pretty much on the same day. But their response to it was, at least with regard to testing, was extremely aggressive. Now, we don't at this point seem to have the capacity for that. And then there's the other issue about whether or not it's logistically feasible, with people moving. But like in this town in Italy, we have to just sort of partition the population into sort of regional clusters and test within those clusters and try to reduce mobility between clusters.
Now, I understand that actually the distribution in space of the incidence of infection is fairly uneven, and that, half the cases are accounted for by a relative handful of localities.
Yeah, at the moment, but then
at the moment
haven't been tested. Yeah, so there are. Yeah, it's still, we still don't know whether the localities that appear not to show, like West Virginia, for example,
because we haven't tested.
We haven't tested much. Yeah. But regarding the economic, response.
Excuse me, just one more thing.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you have to repeat the testing? It wouldn't be enough just to test at one point in time.
You'd have to repeat the testing provided that you had leakage, right? If you were able to really isolate regionally, if you were able to, separate spatially people, then presumably those who are negative will stay negative unless there's unless there's contact. If you've got if you've got a particular geography where you've tested everybody, you've identified the positives, the negatives could pretty much go about their business, it seems to me. But again, I'm not an epidemiologist, and I don't know whether reinfections can occur, and so there are lots of complications here. But regarding the issue of overreaction, it seems as if the dangers are of underreaction are greater. If we do happen to overreact, we wouldn't know it. If we react to the degree in which we manage to avoid the worst case projections, we wouldn't know looking back whether or not the reaction was too much or not. If it's effective, we may look back and say, "Oh, we went too far." But honestly, it seems to me now that there isn't overreaction and there isn't a sense of panic. People are following these directions to the extent that they're following them quite calmly, coping quite well. I don't see much evidence of actual panic, except insofar as claims are being made that directives to shut down businesses, shut down bars, restaurants are overreactions. I don't see these as panic-driven. They seem to be quite calmly executed.
Here's what I mean by overreaction. Let me give an analogy. So we've had some air travel safety concerns that have led us to impose a rather draconian security regime in air transport. Everyone has to be screened. We're concerned, of course, to prevent a terrorist from using the airplane as a weapon or something of that sort. What's the objective probability of that event occurring? Well, prior to 9/11, in retrospect, we can see that probability was high enough that the cumulative cost of having everyone screened carefully before they got on an airplane is worth paying. What's that probability now? Is it the same number? How could we ever stop screening passengers as we do now in air travel, given that the consequences of there being a terrorist incident in the absence of screening would be so deleterious that no one would want to run that risk. And yet we haven't got any way of measuring what the objective risk is. Likewise here, it seems to me there's an interface between two things. One is about the epidemiology. If I slow economic activity in a particular way, I reduce the rate at which the disease disseminates and the ultimate level of incidence of infection. And I can kind of put a number on how valuable it is to reduce the spread of the disease. And I can kind of put a number on what's lost when I reduce economic activity. But what I don't know, is the quantitative relationship between reduced economic activity and slowing of the spread of the disease. So how do I know that the cost I'm paying by, let's say, having everyone work in place for a couple of weeks is too high or too low relative to the benefit that I'm getting? And it strikes me that this decision is being made. Perhaps we don't want to call it a panic. We can say there's a kind of social psychological dynamic at work, but that this decision is being made without due reference to, and it may be impossible to make the reference to, the relative costs and benefits of having done so. Do you see what I'm
actually that's
hoping to articulate?
I think so. And if we just push your analogy a bit further, so at the moment we have quite stringent regulations with regard to airport screening before people get onto a plane. And we don't know whether we're overreacting. And there's no way to really know whether we're overreacting because conditional on the fact that those procedures have been effective, we don't know whether somewhat less stringent procedures would also have been equally effective. This is, that's not a question that's answerable, it seems to me. So we face the same issue with regard to, sheltering in place, social distancing and so on and so forth. But I do want to say one thing, which is that long before there were any kind of government mandated restrictions on mobility or on businesses or on travel, you had a collapse of demand for at least for airline travel. There were flights to Milan were going almost, one person every 3 rows. They were empty long before there was any kind of directive. And in fact, at a time, and I heard part of your conversation with Heather McDonald, at a time when the president at least was expressing the view that this was not something to be terribly concerned about, that it was going to disappear in short order. People at that time were taking matters into their own hands, and the airlines were seeing widespread cancellations, and people were just not traveling. So those are decisions made by individuals. Now, if those individuals happen to be overreacting, I don't see any legitimate case to be made to say to them, to try to create incentives for them to react.
Oh, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Because the the touchstone for evaluating social outcome would be the welfare of the people, and that would be a revealed preference choice that they'd be making, which we should respect.
Right. That's not necessarily the only criteria for welfare, but certainly that's relevant to the argument.
What would be another criteria for welfare?
Economists tend to think in the terms that you have just expressed in some utilitarian terms, but
yes, we do.
Well, there are of course debates about nudges and about paternalism and about whether people really do have their own best interests at heart or have the right information to make those choices. But as a first approximation, I would not try to change that kind of behavior.
Can we digress here just for a minute? Because this interests me greatly. I mean, I'm talking now about what the criterion are for assessing social welfare and whether utilitarianism is sufficient, and what about nudges and paternalism. Yeah. And the concern I want to raise is the substitution of expert judgment or politically imposed judgment for the judgment of individuals, and how that could be justified.
I mean, to some extent, that's exactly what's going on with curfews, with restrictions on mobility, where it's certainly happening in Italy and various other parts of the world where these things are being imposed in fairly draconian fashion. I mean, even in California, Washington.
Yeah. Public goods issues are one thing, someone doesn't take into account the cost they imposed on others when they go outside. So I'm going to compel them to stay in as a sort of the best I can do in terms of social policy, since if I let people make their own decisions, they get to a bad equilibrium.
Right.
That's one thing. Yeah. Okay. Let me leave that one to the side for the moment. What's your thinking about the market and asset valuation and so on?
So, if you look at the major stock market indexes, they peaked about a month ago. They're down about 30%.
The
S&P 500, the Dow, and even broader indexes. But so there's a huge loss in asset value. So those folks, actually, this crisis is hitting the elderly especially hard, because the folks who are close to retirement or are living, are liquidating their assets in order to fund their retirement, are also the most in danger if they were to contract the virus. So really, this is very unequal in terms of the way in which it's affecting the age distribution. The younger folks can probably wait to liquidate their savings, and the stock market will eventually rebound and when things start to get back to normal. So there's that. That reflects, of course, the collapse in profitability, right? For for many sectors. So of course, you've got the airlines and the travel industry and so on, but you've also got people deferring purchases of consumer durables, and you've got a whole lot of economic activity that's been curtailed, and so that's being reflected in these asset prices.
As well as people's expectation of the duration of the disruption.
Yeah, exactly. So the asset price declines certainly reflect that the depth of the loss in profitability, at least. So we should be clear that asset prices, at least stock prices, reflect profitability. They don't reflect, for example, wages, which appear on the cost side of the firm's balance sheet. So it's not GDP. So GDP growth can, and this is a debate that's been going on for the past generation now. We've had pretty decent GDP growth from time to time, but often with wage stagnation. So the stock price is not going to respond to GDP. It'll respond to the strength of the firm's balance sheet. To profits. Now, so this appears to be revealing to us that profits for a substantial period of time will be substantially depressed. And you can see why that might be the case, right? You've got lots of fixed costs in place, no revenues, or, airlines without assistance. All of the airlines apparently facing bankruptcy. which would then, which would make that stock completely worthless. But again, then there's what the asset values are telling us is, that there's some possibility of government support for these companies, in the absence of which there will be disaster. That's really the message that's coming out of this.
So my gut instinct is to think there's so much uncertainty now that we can't really make a straight line connection between changes in the asset prices on the one hand and objective changes in the stream of profits for companies on the other. People are, they are trying to estimate how long the disruption is going to take place, and B, they're trying to estimate what the endogenous policy responses are going to be, which we don't know exactly what they're going to be. Things are moving very fast on the ground. There's a lot that's just not known about the epidemiological dynamic. I mean, about the nature of the virus itself and processes of transmission. And we also have very incomplete information about the extent of infection because the testing hasn't been universally applied.
Well, that will give you volatility. I mean, and we're seeing that. That'll give you volatility.
We're seeing volatility.
But the uncertainty is always there, right? It's highly speculative. Trying to think about the profits of a firm even 2-3 years down the road is always full of uncertainties.
More uncertain now than before.
It's more uncertain now, which is why you see this sort of whipsaw effect, where prices are going up and down so dramatically. You've got circuit breakers being triggered on both the high end and the low end, on a daily basis. So that uncertainty will give you the volatility, but at the same time, the level decline is very real, and I think is reflecting a sort of consensus opinion. So, for example, the latest forecast I saw for the second quarter growth from J.P. Morgan economists was 14% contraction.
Yeah, that's what I saw. That's at an annual rate, 14% contraction at an annual rate.
That's correct, at an annual rate, and that's I haven't seen a 14%. I think the most the quarterly annualized contraction that we've had in the post-war period, I think the largest has been 10%. But you'd have to probably go back to the Great Depression for something like that. And then a 4% decline in the first quarter, and the first quarter was actually okay for a month and a half. And the third quarter, I don't know whether it starts to come back or not. But I heard, I saw on
What
Twitter,
about intertemporal substitution? What about the idea that if the coast clears in 6 months from now, a lot of the spending in the quarter after that will be a kind of backloaded
exactly.
demand.
I saw one estimate that the third quarter would be a positive 8%. Now I think
that's what I mean.
Personally, I think that's
optimistic.
That's been revised. It'll take longer than that, but basically that's exactly right. So people who are deferring purchases of consumer durables, automobiles or electronics, and so on, will provided that their incomes haven't taken a hit. I mean, remember that while we are living, there are people whose incomes have been cut off. The unemployment claims are high, but their debts they've not been released from their debt obligations. They still have to pay their mortgages and their student loans and their rents, and so the idea of the sort of the basic income, one of the policies that's been bandied about by pretty much every corner of the political spectrum right now is, checks mailed to households.
Right.
Basic income type idea. Mitt Romney came out with it on Monday. Adam Schiff endorsed it on Tuesday. You've had different versions of this from Ro Khanna and Tim Ryan and the president himself. So, and the Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
Those can take care of your expenses, your day-to-day expenses, your groceries and so on, maybe partially cover rent, but they're not going to cover most of our debt obligations, especially people who are quite heavily indebted, or who basically need their regular incomes in order to pay make their regular loan payments. Do
you think it's reasonable to ask their creditors to simply forbear, to mandate no evictions for people who don't pay their rent, no foreclosures on people who are deficit on their loan payments and so on?
Those policies are already being debated and implemented in various jurisdictions. That's absolutely right. You can't have under these conditions. That's right.
But I'm contrasting two different ways of trying to help someone who's got debt problems. One would be to send them money, and the other would be to have their creditor forbear. And I'm uncertain about whether it's advisable to distribute the cost of this burden sharing through the indirect method of having landlords simply not collect rent that's due, or creditors not call loans.
If the income is lost, which is going to happen for a very large number of people because of the layoffs, if the income is lost, temporary forbearance is not going to solve the problem. When they come back, when they're hired back, they're not going to get their lost wages, and they may not get hired back at the same.
So they need money.
Absolutely, they need money, and if you're talking about a 14% contraction in the second quarter of the economy, which is unevenly distributed. I mean, some of us will be quite fortunate to not lose much or lose anything at all. Others will lose almost everything as far as their monthly cash flows are concerned.
I mean, our universities have shut down for the time being, but our paychecks have not been interrupted.
Our paychecks have not. I mean, there will be impacts because of the fall in endowment values and so on. There'll be impacts on hiring and perhaps on positions that are renewed on an annual basis. But for you and I, we are basically just shifting to online instruction, trying to keep going. And we are fortunate in that we're able to do that, at least for the foreseeable future, at least for the time being. But if you've got a 14% contraction that's very unequally distributed, then you've got a bunch of people losing pretty much everything, and others doing okay. And it's just impossible to imagine that forbearance and holding back on evictions for 3 months or 6 months is going to help those folks out. All it will do is delay the inevitable. They're not going to be able to suddenly pay their bills.
It also impoverishes the landlords who still have to pay their loans on the mortgages on the properties that they own, and still have to pay the taxes on those properties and the and so on.
Exactly, and that's the problem as well for businesses, right? Because they're partially financed by debt. And
doesn't this point extend to requiring businesses to offer us pay for people who are absent, sick leave and things of this kind, because we want to maintain the income flow to the employee, but the business doesn't pull that money out of the air. It has to somehow finance the sick leave payments.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that has to be facilitated. I think that is definitely part of the conversation, right? So one of the things that the Fed is doing, which I think is valuable, is it has launched this commercial paper funding facility, which effectively allows it to buy commercial paper, so to extend short-term loans to businesses. And this is something that happened very late during the financial crisis. And I feel like, this is one of the facilities that should have been instituted earlier during the financial crisis, but they've done it very early now. And so the Fed is able to, at least for firms that are issuing commercial paper, trying to borrow in the short term to meet payroll or to roll over their existing debt.
The Fed can buy that paper in infused cash.
The Fed can buy that paper, and then when that comes due, they can buy the paper that's released to refinance and so on, and they can keep doing that. They can keep doing that indefinitely. So that's one way to do it. But then again, what you're doing is you're creating debt obligations, and as you said, the money doesn't come from thin air. So if you're losing your revenue from your sales, maintaining your workforce to the extent that you can, paying your bills, there's going to be that deficit over this period of time. That's going to have to be made up. Some businesses will be able to do it. Some won't. Some will go under.
And when they go under, when they go bankrupt, when those storefronts for the retail establishments go empty, when the employees with specific human capital skills are unemployed and those skill employee matches are lost, there will be enormous adjustment costs in any recovery in order to reorganize.
Even the creditors will suffer, right? Because there's no point in being a creditor to someone who can't pay you. So we're all in this. So, we're in this together from an epidemiological sense that we could all be infected by anybody.
Yeah.
But we're all in this together economically. I mean, it's just as tightly connected. Yeah. But very unequal with respect to vulnerabilities and risks.
So this is an opportunity to address some of the inequality concerns that predate the pandemic, or not? Yeah. How do you see that?
Well, so I mean, what in particular do you have in mind? So, for example, with regard to healthcare, I think this is really brought the problem front and center. You know, we are.
Yeah, I had two things in mind, mainly access to healthcare and the argument that Bernie Sanders and others have been making about the universalizing the public provision of healthcare. Yeah. On the one hand, and also about universal income support or some kind of income support, cushioning people. This is a monster shock, but cushioning people from the shocks of life in a more generalized sense. And I have the impression that if you look back over the course of the 20th century at the evolution of the welfare state in the Western wealthy democracies, that the exigencies of war and national emergency played an important role in creating precedents for institutional innovation that expanded the security of the welfare state for everybody after the war had long since gone away.
Exactly right. That's what happened with the British National Health Service after the war. You're absolutely right. And there are two policies that I have been thinking about and occasionally writing about that pertain to this. One is a universal basic income, which was associated with Andrew Yang's campaign, but of course it predates him. It's a conversation that's been going on for quite some time. And one policy that I wish would be discussed a bit more often. Universal basic income is discussed a lot. It's out there, but the one policy that I really wish would be discussed more often is universal accounts at the Federal Reserve. At the moment, only banks can have accounts at the Federal Reserve, and they settle claims against each other. Through the Federal Reserve System overnight. And there's absolutely no reason why we all couldn't do it. The technology is there. It's really, I think, very easy to set up and authenticate. And, these two things to me go hand in hand, that if you're going to have a universal basic income, and what's being proposed right now, I think, according to the Treasury Secretary, they're planning on 2 checks to households, just physical checks mailed to households. Now think about that a little bit. Somebody pointed out just a couple of days ago on Twitter that, who's going to receive these checks? There will be people who have filed taxes, who have an address, to which the Treasury can mail these checks, who haven't moved, who haven't got divorced or separated, who haven't just come into adulthood, or who had incomes that were too low to even declare taxes. A lot of people are not going to be getting these checks, or they're going to get them at the wrong place, or, they may get them at the right address, but they may be, holed up at some other location.
Okay, so there's some kind of intrinsic error rate or targeting inefficiency,
and it's very, it seems unnecessarily clumsy. But quite apart from that, my argument, so we can talk about universal basic income in a minute, but my argument for federal accounts at the Federal Reserve, really, it goes back to the financial crisis. And in the financial crisis, one of the arguments that was made was we have to protect the banking system because we have to protect the payment system. And one of the most crucial functions of the banking system is to allow economic transactions to be made for people, to actually, engage in transactions with each other and make the necessary payments for us to receive our paychecks and to spend them. And this having the ability of accounts at the Fed would have would allow people to have safety. There's no reason to insure these accounts; they're completely safe, and the ability to make transactions in a way that protects the payment system absolutely and under any circumstances, no matter what crisis hits. So the payment system would be protected. No matter what's happening to the banking system, you wouldn't have to bail out the banks indirectly to protect the payment system. I thought that was an argument.
Let me just be clear about this. What do you mean by the payment system? You mean when I purchase something, I have the capacity to transfer funds to this person who's selling the goods to me as an individual consumer?
That's right. So you have the capacity. So you have let's say you pay your rent check, or if or your mortgage payment to a bank. You have the capacity to make transactions. If you use your credit card, let's say, for transactions, you will then use your your checking account to then transfer funds to the credit card company, which transfers funds to the vendors, and so on and so forth.
In what way was that threatened by the financial crisis of 2008?
Just bankruptcy. 12 out of the 13 major banks were facing bankruptcy at that time, and your federal deposits in the banking system are only insured up to a certain amount. The FDIC insurance was increased during the crisis, but at the same time, it's a fixed amount. There's a limit to how much insurance you have.
I understand, but long before we would have gotten to the point that the Bank of America could not honor its obligation to me because of my checking account balance, right, would we not have encountered the problem of financial institutions failing because of the inability to roll over their indebtedness and the sort of run on the bank kind of problem?
Yes, exactly. So this was exactly so. So
that's not a payment system problem, is it, or not in the way that you mean that?
But a financial institution that runs into those kind of problems raises questions for regulators about whether or not that institution should be allowed to fail. And one of the arguments made to prevent it from failing is precisely because you don't want to jeopardize the payment system. Okay. Of course, there are other reasons that are put forward, to keep lending flowing and so on.
Right.
But the point is that if it's going bankrupt, why not let it go bankrupt? And if people's deposits in checking accounts in banks were similar to what are now called money market mutual funds, where they're pretty safe, but they're not absolutely guaranteed. Then people could have guaranteed accounts at the Fed and somewhat less guaranteed, but maybe more lucrative accounts in commercial banks. And they could transfer from one to the other, and they could make their payments in either way that they like. They could carry on making them the way they do now, but at least they'd have that backstop. In addition to that, if you had to inject a huge amount of liquidity into the economy, as you have to do right now, through something like a temporary basic income, it could be done very, very quickly. Right?
Simply by crediting the accounts.
Yeah, you credit by crediting these accounts. Now, we don't have this kind of thing in place, so it's a bit hard to imagine.
What's special about the Fed? I'm not sure everyone will understand who hasn't studied monetary economics why the Fed is not a bank like other banks.
Well, it can't go bankrupt. I mean, it has.
Why not?
Because it has the capacity to create money. It has the capacity to create the unit of account. I mean, it can credit. I mean, it has a balance sheet, but.
Well, the metaphor would be when people come to ask for their money from the Fed can run a printing press and hand them greenbacks and honor its obligations in that way.
Yes, if they really want greenbacks, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it concrete, just as an illustration of the idea.
Yes. I think that's one way to look at it. That they. In
any case, checks drawn on an account for which the Fed says there's a positive balance are legal tender, and people have to accept those checks in obligation, in acknowledgement of the debt having been discharged.
Exactly, that's exactly the status of reserves at the central bank that are held by commercial banks right now. So those are as good as cash, and so they would be safe, but. I just, it just seems to me that this is something that, sometimes referred to as postal banking, or, there are various names given to it. It's an idea that's been floated around since the 1930s at least, but it doesn't get much serious discussion. And, I'm just not quite sure why.
Individual accounts with the central bank of the country.
Yeah, at one time.
In lieu of individual accounts with commercial banks.
In addition to, the individual accounts at commercial bank would probably allow you a lot more flexibility, to pay credit cards, to do, all kinds of things there's a lot more you could probably do with those. But if you can transfer back and forth from Fed accounts, you can have at least part of your
Are these central bank accounts extant anywhere in the world at the present time?
Not to my knowledge, but they're from time to time you get a discussion about it, and then it fades away. But not to my knowledge. I mean, the idea of postal banking is there may be places that have implemented something like that. Certainly, postal savings accounts have. Many countries have. I think Japan has a system. Where you can have savings accounts of this kind, but India used to have, maybe they still do. There are countries that have something fairly close to it, but not quite. And, So,
now, one of the points you make for this in the nice piece that you should tell people where they could find it, that you wrote about this, is that the existence of universal accounts at the central bank would get us out of the business of subsidizing commercial banks who borrow, in effect, from us when we put money into them, and then turn around and make loans on that money, and are not troubled by the prospect that should those loans fail, they won't be able to pay back the account holder, because we have deposit insurance where, in effect, the federal government is guaranteeing the repayment of those funds. And so it's indirectly subsidizing risk-taking by the commercial bank as it invests the funds of its depositors.
Absolutely. So this is the debate about the so-called Volcker rule, right? So the idea that, deposits can help to finance proprietary trading by commercial banks. And there's another aspect to this, which is that if your deposits at a commercial bank are insured, you really don't need to worry about what that bank is doing on the asset side. How risky its asset position is.
So there's a moral hazard problem.
There's a moral hazard problem, exactly. Yeah. And basically, if people are allowed to have accounts at the Fed, there's absolutely no reason to have an FDIC at all. Like I said, your commercial bank accounts would be like money market mutual funds. So they'll pay you a bit more probably than the Fed accounts, and you can do other things with them. Or they may be more expensive, because of the services that come with them. But the point is that you have the safety if you want it, to the extent that you want it. But the reason why I proposed this actually in the context of basic income. So you mentioned the piece. So I've written about this a couple of times before, but the most recent piece in relation to the policies that were floated by Mitt Romney and Adam Schiff and others this week, that's on my blog. Now, people can just write my name and type the word blog, and they'll find it. It's the latest post up there on my blog.
This is Rajiv Sethi at Blogspot.
That's right. So they can see that. But the reason I mentioned it in this context was because that's the ideal mechanism, it seems to me, to implement a universal basic income. Either a temporary one, as is being proposed now, or a more or a permanent one, as was proposed by the Yang campaign and various other folks. Now, let me just say one thing about universal basic income, because I know we disagree on this, and I'd like to have that debate. But let me just say one thing about universal basic income. Right now, we are facing an economic catastrophe that's very generalized, very widespread. There are inequalities in the degree to which people are affected, but right now there are no regions that escape pretty much. I would say, every urban area, every area is going to have some people who are going to be hurt very badly, and others are going to be relatively unscathed. But it's generalized. There's a feeling of systemic collapse, and so there's an impetus. There's the idea of $1 trillion stimulus. It has bipartisan support, and you've got people who seem to think that this is a very good idea, and it is. I'm not saying that it's not. But the kind of emergency conditions under which we are living in a generalized way right now are precisely what certain localities have been experiencing for a generation. There are parts of this country where there were one or two big employers, and the whole town was essentially employed either by them or by subsidiary firms. They shut down partly because of trade shocks, partly because of technology shocks. Once those big employers shut down, those towns have been devastated, and we've had many stories written about these places. There's a book that came out just this week by Anne Case and Angus Deaton called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. And they document some of the implications of this with regard to, drug and alcohol abuse, suicide, liver disease, untimely death. There's a decline in, life expectancy. There's an increase in midlife mortality among certain demographic groups in this country, especially
that varies by region, and that can be associated with general economic decline or with trade impacted depression, localized depression in certain.
Yes. I believe that's now pretty well documented. There's there's a work by David Autor and his colleagues and Case and Deaton and so on. Now, for those folks, what we are all living through right now has been a condition of life for a generation. And, the one advantage that I see of a universal basic income is, without trying to really identify where those pressure points are, what places are collapsing and which others are thriving, and directing resources, pinpointing them to the places most in need. What this does is it sets up an automatic mechanism for areas such as that to have at least a floor in local expenditures. I mean, at least a floor in what the people are getting in, which can then be spent locally, at least on non-tradables, on whether it is grocery stores or restaurants, or that can keep the local businesses alive. So
here's the thing that, would cause someone like me to at least pause and not to say yes or no, but just to have the concern. So one of the things that I would want to happen when there's trade impact is a reallocation of resources, including having people move.
Yeah.
I just give that as one example. I want there to be an adjustment to the new situation that recognizes the economic realities. If I soften the blow of the cost burden of having industry shut down or whatever, I lock people into patterns of behavior that might not be the most efficient, or at least I change the relative cost calculation. So I'm not saying that's not something we should do. I'm simply saying that's a cost to be put on the other side of the ledger.
I understand the argument, but I think it's an abstract argument that doesn't carry much empirical force, and I'll tell you why. It's firstly because people don't move. So this is what the David Dorn and David Autor and Hansen article on the China shock does. Is it shows for a decade or so people just live with the deteriorating conditions, and some move and others don't. That's one factor. The movement, labor mobility in response to these shocks is extremely slow, even without any such.
Why not subsidize mobility rather than give them a floor?
That's another possibility. I think that's what certainly considering. But let me give you the other argument, which is that those people who can retool, who can move, or who have either their individual characteristics or the good fortune to be able to adjust, do move. They do move. And I suspect that they would move even if there was a universal basic income. It's not going to make you fabulously wealthy. It's just putting a floor on your consumption. And the people who are moving now under current conditions, I suspect most of them would move. I don't think empirically, and honestly, I have to confess that I am, this is guesswork in part, but I don't think the patterns of mobility are going to be much affected by this. But what will be affected is the sort of local ecology of businesses. So, the floor on consumption is also a floor on expenditure. And a lot of that expenditure is going to be local. Some of that expenditure will be on online stuff that's delivered from outside. But you're going to have people going to local restaurants or local bars or local, urgent care facilities or whatever it might be. And those local expenditures are going to sustain some level of local economy in places where the economy has been completely devastated and just left for dead. So that's my argument. It is that, we see as a society a level of anxiety right now that some parts of the country have been seeing, for a long, long time. And if a basic income now, a temporary basic income now makes sense for the whole country, why not consider it, when this crisis is passed? That's the argument.
Just to push back a little bit.
Yeah.
I can identify by industry or by region people whose livelihood has been impacted by some exogenous event, like a trade adjustment.
Yeah.
And I can direct assistance to them, and perhaps I can do it more effectively if they have accounts at the Fed. I can identify them and I can direct assistance to them. Universal assistance is going to have less target efficiency because it's going to be distributing benefits to everyone, including the majority of people who are not adversely impacted by these shifts.
Well, that's I'm not sure about that. Let me tell you what I think about that, and then we can see if we can get consensus on this. So let's take policies like universal access to schooling, or Medicare or Social Security.
Yeah,
these are universal policies, and in fact they're popular in part because they're universal, and they carry with them what I consider to be extremely valuable, which is the universality of dignity and equality of dignity, which is that, you're not really saying, okay, you are in need and, this other person is not, and so I will help you and I will not help them. And I believe that creates indignities that bother me. That's one reason why I prefer universal policies in general. But leave that to one side. Let's talk about this issue of, because it's a very important issue that's part of the current debate about targeting. So, the basic income plan of Khanna and Ryan basically only wants payments to go to people with less than $65,000 in their last tax return. Whereas the opposite is that, you get the checks going to, as some people put it, the Trump sons, right? And the question is, isn't the fact that it's less targeted mean that it's wasteful or in some sense suboptimal or, not doing the job
yes,
that we could be doing? In general, what you're doing with the universal basic income is giving people purchasing power, right? The power to consume goods and services. The economy produces a certain amount of goods and services. That's what our GDP tells us, right? And to the extent that they can produce those, consume those goods and services, they get a greater share than they otherwise would, right? The people who are receiving these checks. Now, fiscally, you're gonna finance this either with borrowing or with taxes. Let's suppose that you finance it with taxes. If you have a universal basic income, because of the breadth of coverage, is going to require you to raise more in taxes. Those taxes are going to fall on the people who are least in need, and in a sense, the net payments that they're receiving may not be very different than they would be under a targeted policy. So the point I'm really trying to make is that you need to take into account what you're giving millionaires and billionaires in universal basic income. You need to take into account the funding mechanism. And that funding mechanism is going to, and then look at what they're getting in net terms. And you can easily think of examples, and I think Greg Mankiw a few years ago said, basically that it's entirely equivalent. The targeted and non-targeted income policies are fully equivalent. If you fund them, there's a way of funding them in such a way to make them actually identical. You're talking about transfers, and the right way to think about
this presumes a progressive tax system, I assume, right? Such that better off people are paying more. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's almost inescapable, right?
Okay, I take the point.
Yeah. So I think that it's not clear. Let me just put it that way. I won't make a stronger statement than that. I think it's not clear that the universal policies are, in a sense, benefiting the people at the high end of the income distribution. They're more costly. Those costs are going to be imposed on those people more than other people. So on a net basis, it's not clear to me that that's a strong counter argument. But I don't want to go too far with that.
Let me ask you one final thing. You'd mentioned in our conversation before we started recording that you were working with Danielle Allen, the political philosopher, the group of people thinking about the broader philosophic issues that were raised, the social justice issues that were raised by the pandemic and our reaction to it.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so Danielle just brought together, this is the kind of thing that Danielle does so amazingly well to tackle big questions from different disciplinary points of view. So she just pulled together a group of people, and I came into it relatively late, but fortunately not too late to participate. And so she's basically pulled together what might end up being a white paper or a publication, and maybe may spawn other pieces of writing, but trying to deal with the kinds of trade-offs we're making right now, not just in terms of the costs and benefits that we economists tend to focus on, but more broadly in terms of the costs to liberty, to democracy, to freedom, to the political process. How can we respond to this crisis in a way that preserves our institutions, preserves things that we value about our, non-economic.
What are some of the concrete threats to our institutions posed by this crisis?
Well, for example, the degree to which the governor or the mayor of a city or the governor of a state can impose restrictions on people's mobility.
Yeah.
They may have certain, considerable benefits in the moment, but one doesn't want to necessarily set a precedent for, the authoritarian actions in the future. And she argues, and at some point this paper will be public. At the moment, it's not being circulated publicly, but she argues that there are arguments that can be made in good faith today that cause a change of institutions that can then be exploited by people arguing in bad faith tomorrow. And this is a concern that we ought to be thinking about. And this is, Danielle to me is, is just one of the most interesting and important thinkers, in the public sphere right now in America. And so I think this is just...
For those who don't know, Danielle Allen is professor of politics and political philosophy at Harvard and director of the Sraffa Center for the Study of Ethics at Harvard.
Right. And you and I both were involved with the volume that she edited.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Difference Without Domination.
That's right. That should be out by University of Chicago Press this year.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's right. So these are bigger issues even than we've been discussing. What are the impacts of...
Well, did not
our short-term reaction on our institutions?
Weren't some elections postponed or canceled someplace?
Yeah. So that's exactly the kind of trade-off that we need to really think about very carefully. So, so Florida, Arizona, and Illinois decided to hold the elections last Tuesday while Ohio canceled them. And Ohio canceled them in the face of a judge's decision disallowing the cancellation, which was then reversed, I understand. But that's exactly the kind of decision that needs to be thought about very carefully. What are the procedures really under which such decisions should be made? What are the criteria? What are the some of the intangible costs that they impose on us moving forward?
And in a federal system, it strikes me that this kind of question about the authority of decision makers at different levels of the system to make freedom limiting impositions is even starker. I mean, whose responsibility is it? Can the president order a state to shut down its schools, for example?
Yeah.
Or,
I don't know, but the president can do a fair amount, under war powers. I mean, there's the
national emergency. That,
they can certainly, I believe, repurpose factories and
they can mobilize. Yeah,
and maybe should be, because I think that one of the most urgent shortfalls that we are facing right now is demand for ventilators and masks, but especially ventilators. Both actually.
And I gather that they're operating mainly on persuasion. They're asking private concerns to make materials available.
Construction companies. So the construction companies to donate their stock because they have these N95 masks. But the conditions under which some healthcare workers are operating at the moment are really quite appalling. If you think about it, they're putting their lives at risk and they're having to reuse masks and, there have been emergency room physicians in critical condition. There are people who have died trying to save lives of others. It seems to me that these are the kinds of actions that the federal government can and should be taking very, 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 very quickly. I don't think it's an overreaction at all.
So what are you thinking about saying in the context of Danielle Allen's project to, review the ethics of public imposition in this crisis situation?
So my contribution is quite narrow and limited to, trying to deal with the economic shocks and how to deal with the economic shocks. And my contribution there really is to try to point out that there's two kinds of economic effects that are going on, what might be called effects on composition and effects on scale. And we haven't talked much about the effects on composition, which is that there's a collapse in demand for certain types of goods and services, travel, entertainment, and so on. At the same time,
restaurants, hotel, theaters, and so on.
Yeah, at the same time as there's spiking demand for hand sanitizers and toilet paper and the things that people are hoarding.
Delivery services.
Delivery services, absolutely. Amazon has hired 100,000 workers and upped the wage a bit. And of course, the healthcare services, and then the protective equipment. And the question then becomes, well, how do we deal with changing the composition of supply? Can the market do it, or does one need to have non-market interventions to do it? So that's one category of intervention, and the other is on scale, which is what we spend a lot of time talking about today, which is that there's a contraction of overall economic activity. Which means
why would you expect the market not to be able to handle the composition problem?
Well, if it's entirely a market solution, then they would have to see profit in it, right? Now, if you're going to repurpose a factory, produce a whole bunch of ventilators, and the crisis passes, and you're stuck with this stock, and there's no buyer of last resort.
Yeah.
Why would you take the risk? Why not just hold off?
And you're not letting ventilators trade at any kind of market clearing price either. Presumably, you're administering the price of ventilators.
That raises other concerns with regard to prioritization, right, of healthcare services. That's right. I mean, we don't. Many people would. There have been requests, by the way. There was an article where there are people with substantial wealth who have tried to procure ventilators for themselves just in case. And most people, and sort of understandably, cringe at that. They don't look upon that very favorably. So we don't.
Well, especially if you're hoarding the ventilator, if you have it sitting there, you're not using it, but you have it as insurance against the prospect that you might need it.
But isn't that a classic market solution, Glenn? Isn't that exactly what one means when we say leave it to the market? I mean, people are allowed to engage in market transactions for hoarding, right? Which is why the market responses to the problem of the changes in the composition of demand, and this is the case that I make in this piece, is not adequate. It really requires something else.
I see it as an interesting problem. I mean, on the other hand, if I fix the price of toilet paper at a low number and don't allow it to go up, and people are afraid they won't be able to find it when they go to the market next week, I'll end up with a lot of people buying cheap toilet paper and keeping it in their basements and creating the shortage that they're afraid of. Whereas if I allowed for the price to go up, or if I allowed for a kind of arbitrage, I would undercut that hoarding dynamic. So,
yeah, but I think that the better way to deal with that is to simply ration sales. I mean, to have people.
Yeah, I get it. To limit the amount they can buy.
Limit the amount that they can buy. You don't want to be pricing people out of toilet paper. And in fact, that's what's happening with cleaning supplies. There are people who have been hoarding and selling on Amazon, making
Yeah, I know. This is a classic application of Marty Weissman's old. Do you remember that Prices versus Quantities paper of his from so long ago?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's unfortunate he's no longer here with us.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's right. I do think that economists as a whole. I mean, and neither you nor I would say are typical economists, but as a whole tend to think that the price mechanism is always the better default solution. I don't think.
I think it's sometimes a better solution than the quantity imposed regulation. But it's not always the best solution.
That's the point, and we're not facing typical conditions. But of course, it does raise questions, which I hope we can maybe have another episode on at some point about whether or not we think about situations in crisis mode, as we are doing right now, has lessons for thinking about them differently when things return to normal. Are they, as you said, many big changes in society have come on the heels of major disruptions like war and depression. And they caused us to rethink how matters should be arranged under more normal times. And it'd be interesting to think about, does this give us an opportunity to think about how to do things better when we're back to normal?
I think that's a suitable final word for us here. It brings to mind Rahm Emanuel's, never let a crisis go to waste, but in a different sense. I mean, he sort of, I understood, meant it as a strategic opportunity to fix the agenda for my political program.
Yes.
But you mean it as an intellectual opportunity to think differently about business as usual and perhaps to gain some insight.
Yeah, exactly. I'm grateful to you for pointing out the distinction. I certainly didn't mean it in the way that Rahm Emanuel meant it, but the phrase itself is apt. Yes. Yeah.
All right, Rajiv Sethi, Barnard College, Columbia University. Thanks so much. I appreciate you giving me your time here to discuss these matters at the Glenn Show.
Always a pleasure, Glenn. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.